on China's boycott of Japan's APA hotel chain over a very controversial book in which it denied the historical facts of the Nanjing Massacre. We are joined in our Beijing studio, Victor Gao, our current affairs commentator.
Thank you.
In Medford, we have Mr. Sung-Yoon Lee, who is the Kim Koo Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at Fletcher School, Tufts University. In Tallahassee, we have Mr. Kurt Piehler, who is the Director and Associate Professor of History Institute of World War II and the Human Experience Department of History of Florida State University. Meanwhile, we're also joined on the phone in Kyoto by Professor Takesato Watanabe, who is a Professor Emeritus at Doshisha University. Gentlemen, I want to welcome the four of you for joining us on this very important topic. Professor Watanabe, I want to go to you first on the phone. Very briefly, can you help us understand what exactly is the background of this APA hotel chain? Who are running it, and why are they making such a political statement about false historical facts?
Yeah. CEO of the APA Hotel Group is Mr. Toshio Motoya. He is the extreme rightist wing leader, and he is very close to Mr. Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister of Japan. And those people are gathered together in the group of the Japan Congress, and they are very influential. At the same time, Mr. Motoya Toshio, he is denying from the bottom of his heart, as far as he is in the wisdom world, he never admits the Nanjing Massacre, and also he believes that the comfort women or the prostitutes both are completely wrong. So the journalists and also educated people in Japan, they are very, very, shameful, and we regret so very much. Thank you.
Professor Watanabe, I also understand from references I read earlier that this hotel chain owner has been providing political donations to some of the key politicians inside Japan, huge amount of political donations. Can you help us understand more about that connection?
Yes, it is true. And also, Mr. Motoya, you see, have so many rightist politicians in the local conferences, and also the diet members of the nation scale. So he's very, very, in that sense, influential. But actually, you see, intellectuals do not believe him.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Takesato Watanabe joining us from Kyoto. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us on the phone. Now let's go to the other three panelists with us. Professor Piehler, I want to ask you about this. What do you think the founder is thinking? That he could just imagine that all the people living in his hotel would not be able to notice this book, which has huge historical facts which are false in the books?
I was sort of stunned when I learned about this incident. To begin with, just as a sheer sort of pragmatic way, I can't believe he would think this was good for business as someone who's trying to court Chinese tourists. And frankly, I don't understand why you would sort of say the Nanjing Massacre did not occur when we have international eyewitnesses, including a German diplomat who worked for the Nazi government at the time the massacre took place, who reported this Berlin. I just find this denial of the Nanjing Massacre just inexplicable.
Professor Lee from the United States as well, it is not just Nanjing Massacre, but also the total denial of sex slaves, also known as the comfort women, during the Second World War, solicited by the Japanese army to provide to their soldiers. It's not only from China, Southeast Asian countries, South Korea as well. So, Professor, what do you make of this?
Well, you know, if in the Trump brand hotels, before Mr. Trump was elected president, there were books denying the Holocaust or that there was slavery in America, it would be international news. This issue is quite significant, and it reflects the environment, the mood, the political mood created under the Abe government, which has emboldened right-wing historical denialists to be assertive and to come up with their own pseudo-history, which actually resonates among the generation of young Japanese students today who are not really educated in Japan's crimes against humanity committed throughout the 1930s and 1940s. So this is a serious ongoing international bilateral issue that has been resurging under the Abe administration, and this kind of atavistic spurts of historical denialism will continue for the foreseeable future unless there is a fundamental change to the Japanese educational system.
We don't know whether that is likely to change at this point if you look at the political atmosphere inside Japan. In fact, this incident, after being exposed on social media by a young woman coming from the United States and confirmed independently by the media, including Xinhua News Agency coming from China, as well as major media outlets in Japan, has led to great controversy. Let's take a look at how people are reacting to this.
So when we were in Tokyo, we stayed in this hotel.
Two students from New York University in the United States posted a viral video on the controversial book they found in their room at a Japanese upper hotel chain. The video spread like wildfire on social media, stoking ill feelings among the Chinese over the denial that the historic rape of Nanjing ever happened. The students uploaded a video with a Weibo account named Cat and Sid, saying that it has compelling content.
Okay, on page 37, he writes, illogical things are being taught as history. Take, for example, the theory of the massacre of 300,000 people in Nanking. The fact that he is taking the money of Chinese and Korean tourists who stay at his hotels without them being aware of his political views and where their money is going when they stay at this hotel just strikes me as disrespectful and kind of dishonest.
Within 10 days, their post has been liked 430,000 times and got 37,000 replies supporting their revelation. It was reposted more than 750,000 times and led to calls for a boycott of both the hotel and travel to Japan and China. Despite the avalanche of criticism, the CEO of the hotel chain still refused to remove the book from its guest rooms.
People will forget what has happened after a few months except for the hotel's name. An initial loss in revenue will be made up for by brand awareness over this issue.
Well, we have seen the story from the very beginning until what is going on right now. Mr. Gao, as Chinese, what can you do?
First of all, I think what the Upper Hotel is doing and its founding and owner is doing is not only providing false information, but is committing injustice to the victims of the Nanjing Massacre, as well as hundreds of thousands of women who were forced into sex slavery by the Japanese fascists in the Second World War. Secondly,
and of course their family members as well.
Absolutely. Secondly, I think what the Japanese government is doing in abiding by this owner of Upper Hotel chain in Japan adds further injustice. And I think any attempt in Japan to deny the atrocities committed by the Japanese fascists in the Second World War, including against the United States, as well as against China, Korea, etc., are really ludicrous, because history is written as it is, and any denial by Japan cannot succeed. Thirdly, I think it is the first time, in my judgment, that the Chinese government is now urging the Chinese companies, tourist groups, and tourists to boycott this APA group. This is unprecedented, and I think this means that the Chinese government knows how to use the boycott weapon, which the American government uses very frequently, and in this case applies to this APA hotel. And I hope APA will back down and realize the injustice done by the fascists in the Second World War.
At this point, Professor Piehler, the Apple Hotel was suggesting, well, we could remove, quote, the books. That seems to be very arrogant, to say the least. But Professor Piehler, at this point, what we are worried is not just about one hotel owner, one hotel chain. It's about the whole spread of false and feudal history about the Second World War, including with the United States and in China, by the Japanese younger generation. What can we do, really?
Well, one of the things that I'm struck by the ultra-nationalists in Japan is what they remember about World War II and what they don't remember. Not just the war crimes committed, but Japan's war effort from a military historian's perspective was a fiasco. Men were killed for, Japanese soldiers who fought very bravely were killed for no good reason on futile campaigns. They were left to starve on islands. And I wish the rightists in Japan, the ultranationalists, would come to some grips how futile the Japanese war effort was. And I think all countries involved in World War II must remember how devastating World War II was for all the nations involved, particularly in Asia. Both Japan, China, Korea, all the nations involved lost millions of people. And I fear as the World War II generation is gone, we are forgetting those lessons, that the young people in many countries have not learned the lessons of how horrendous World War II was and how we must avoid similar conflicts, particularly now that we have widespread distribution of nuclear weapons.
Professor Lee, are you concerned with this younger generation of Japanese? Are they likely to be tricked into something by their politicians who try to create a pseudo history once again?
Well, back in the 1980s, in the early and mid-80s, we saw the Japanese Ministry of Education, the education minister, Tanaka, issue a decree that Japanese history throughout the 1930s and 40s be not completely whitewashed, but to tone down Japan's excesses and focus on the positive. And there were many euphemistic languages, expressions adopted. For example, Japan did not invade China, but advanced into China. So we've seen this kind of government, quasi-government sponsored whitewashing of history in the past. What's troubling is it's happening again, of course. The owner of the upper chain may be a private citizen with, however, very close connection to the Abe government and Mr. Abe himself. Over the past few years under the Abe administration, there have been serious government-mandated efforts to whitewash the history of comfort women, portraying them as common prostitutes, emphasizing the fact that there's no smoking gun evidence of state-sponsored coercion. I'm fairly sure that in any country there is no government-mandated instruction to massacre civilians during wartime, but massacre of civilians happen. So this kind of distortion and false narrative, we've seen an outpouring of such over the past few years, and that is troubling because the current generation, that's what they are taught and come to believe and embrace.
But you know, it has a lot to do with what the government and also the politicians are doing at this point. The Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Abe, visited Pearl Harbor and did, to a certain extent, express the condolences to those who have lost their lives, the Americans in Pearl Harbor. And yet many of the Asian countries, Professor Piehler, are calling the Japanese prime ministers to do the same to its Asian neighbors, and we haven't seen much response from that. The question is, Mr. Piehler, is Tokyo thinking about buttering Washington and therefore can go its way about whatever they believe as the fact of history?
I'm in some ways completely perplexed what the Japanese government is thinking on all kinds of levels. To begin with, I fear that the Japanese are playing with fire in the sense that there are Americans who would want to remind other Americans about Japanese war crimes committed against Americans. They were fewer than committed against China, Korean, and others, but they were still some significant war crimes. I also just, you know, in the question of apology, I guess, as I've often expressed before when asked, it's long overdue. It should come directly from the emperor, so it is above politics, partisan politics. And I also think one of the apologies and a reckoning should happen in Japan is how inept the military leadership was on the most basic level. It was not only an immoral war, but it was a badly fought war that many innocent soldiers were killed by inept commanders and who conducted themselves criminally. And I just don't understand why Japan would not only want to alienate China, but why would it want to alienate South Korea, you know, given the politics of the region. So I'm at just times perplexed by it. I will just say it's tough for nations, particularly defeated nations, but even nations that are victors, to apologize. Nations have a hard time saying they're wrong. The Americans have had a hard time reckoning with things like slavery, with the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. So I know this is a tough thing for politicians to do, but even average citizens.
Before I go to the Chinese guest, let me ask you, Professor Lee, do you have an answer to the questions posed by your colleague?
Well, you know, to use the cliche often repeated, put a face to the issue. It would be very helpful if, say, an internationally recognized figure like, I don't know, Jackie Chan took up the issue. The more you visit, for example, the Yasukuni Shrine, Chinese tourists, Korean tourists, and visit especially the history museum, so-called, within the compound, you will see what kind of false narrative that some segments of the Japanese society with great influence on public opinion are advocating that Japan was pulled into a righteous war, a just war, and lost the Second World War because of U.S. military superiority. It was victor's justice. That narrative is very strongly put forth at the Yasukuni Shrine War Museum. It's offensive, but you need to go and see it. So I hope all the tourists, Chinese tourists who will boycott the hotels, will in turn go and see what kind of falsehood is presented boldly at the Yasukuni Shrine Museum.
Mr.
May I add to that?
Sir, very briefly.
Yeah, I've been to that war museum, and 80% of that museum is fine, but the 20% that is horrendous and is incredibly offensive and distorts history. And I would also encourage tourists to view that. My colleagues, when I taught at Japan as a Fulbrighter, would never set foot in that museum or shrine because of its distortion of the war.
False, horrendous, those are the words these two professors coming from America describe Yasukuni Shrine and also some of the version of history some Japanese politicians try to spread around in the country. Mr. Gao, talking about specific figures, we do have Iris Chang, who is an Chinese-American journalist writing about the rape of Nanking, and she suffered psychologically as a result of the horrendous history that she has discovered about this Nanking massacre, and also pressure coming from the right-wing Japanese chasing her around the world, threatening her life and those of her families. So these have become facts these days because we all know about her stories now. So will specific figures be able to raise people's awareness about what is going on inside history and why people are portraying it in such a false way? Are we going to repeat the mistakes once again about war?
I think, philosophically speaking, the peace-loving people throughout the world need to get united in defending the victory legacies of the world anti-fascist war in the Second World War. And the result is clear. Fascist Japan was defeated because it committed atrocities against humanity, and no one could reverse the verdict on the Japanese fascist atrocities. Therefore, I would urge the Japanese government and the Japanese people that Japan can become a greater nation and the Japanese nation can become a greater people if they face squarely with the atrocities committed by the fascists in the Second World War. If they keep denying, they will not achieve truly the great nation status in the world.
Well, we could, of course, Professor Piehler, go into all these psychological studies about the country and about the people as to why there has been such a phenomenon, but we probably don't have the time and the energy to do that. At this point, we really need them to face the fact. Having said that, though, there are a lot of Japanese people that really knows the history and try to promote the real facts of the history around the country. It's not easy for them either at this moment politically. But let me ask you this. Politically inside the United States, President Donald Trump comes into power. There's a big question about the alliance with the United States and Japan. At this point, Prime Minister Abe, it is no secret that he's lining up in the team trying to meet President Donald Trump. Do you think the US president, as the president of the United States, should be able to clarify, at least from his perspective, about the history and also emphasize on the importance of countries involved in the war to recognize the facts of the history, Professor Piehler?
To be honest, I think that question would be better addressed to the president or to his press secretary. I really don't know what Donald Trump would do. I would certainly want him, the United States, to sort of urge Japan to really come with a reckoning with its history and really do what the Germans have done in many ways very admirably in really acknowledging this and becoming a great country. And I should really emphasize, it pains me to criticize Japan. I spent a Fulbright in Japan. I have a number of Japanese graduate students who have studied with me. I have a real fondness for Japan and love of Japan. And so it just pains me to see the Japanese not reckoning with this, and as the previous speaker had said, not really becoming a great nation that it can in many ways be and is. And this is, to me, just such a barrier, and I fear that this will poison relationships with a number of countries unnecessarily, in the sense that this is something that should have been done a long time ago, and I can't believe we're still discussing it.
Oh, I can't believe it either, Professor Piehler, believe me. Professor Lee, U.S. and Japan relations has been very dramatic during the Second World War, enemies toward one another. After that, allies. At this point, people are still trying to figure it out with the new president coming in. What do you think at this point, history vis-a-vis today's politics?
Well, President Obama visited Japan and South Korea in late April 2014, and in South Korea, President Obama said, with respect to the so-called comfort women issue, that it was an egregious crime, egregious human rights violation, crime against humanity. That was not really widely reported in Japan, but that kind of statement, even what is really stating the obvious, but that kind of small stand for history, for justice by a high-profile American policymaker, the president or the Secretary of State, while on a visit to Japan or East Asia would be very helpful, I think.
Final word from you, very briefly, Mr. Gao.
Well, I don't think it is in Japan's interest at all to keep denying the atrocities in the Second World War, because don't forget the victor nations are the United States, China, Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and the Great Britain. So they are really, denying these facts to these great nations, and China will have no tolerance against such repeated denial of historical facts. Japan committed these atrocities, and that's a fact, and every Japanese need to square off with these facts.
All countries, all peoples victimized by the war deserve an appropriate apology from those who are starting the war and also involved in the war. Thank you so much, Victor Gao, Sung-Yoon Lee, and Kurt Piehler. Really appreciate it for the three of you gentlemen for being with us, and we also like to express our appreciation.
Thank you very
so
much.